Well,
Yep.
Yes.
okay, Pat.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk for long. Basically, compared to the last year, we're pretty much just continued progress. We're chugging along, doing the things that we've been doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so give you a quick update of, and this is what our business is, and there'll be a couple of obligatory slides for anyone who's not familiar with what we do, and talk about YottaDB, Octo, and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so the business model is that the software is free. So everything we do is 100% free and open source. All of our work is under various projects at gitlab.com/YottaDB. And when one of our developers, submits a pull request and another developer reviews it, all of that review comments, developer responses, any discussion, all of that is out in the open for anyone to see. So this is truly, all of our development is done out in the open. And and then the way we make money is that the software is free, the people are not free. We sell services on commercial terms with support level agreements, and the support contracts fund software development. Next slide, please. Oh, and by the way, feel free to ask me any questions that at any time, because I think we have time. So, company was founded in 2017. So there are 5 people on this planet who have worked on the code base for more than 25 years, and 3 of them work at YottaDB. And we have customers in North America, of course, and Europe and Asia. And at this point, about 90% of our business is international, meaning outside the US. And we have customers actually paying us to use YottaDB in languages other than M, including Go, Lua, and Node.js. And as we also have Octo customers. And all of our revenue is plowed back into software development. So my goal at this point is basically to operate the company as close to break even as I can and put all of our revenue back into software development. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is the obligatory marketing slide, and a couple of the differences between YottaDB, the database, and the upstream code base GTM is the fact that YottaDB is language agnostic. And the thing is, we also scale down, not just scale up. So on a consumer grade micro SD card on a Raspberry Pi Zero, you can still get thousands of database accesses per second. Next slide, please. So from the last VistA community meeting, the big thing is basically a release R1.34, and that was in February of this year. We hope to release R1.36 by the end of the year. And some of the, from a performance point of view, the faster string pool garbage collection is an interesting feature, because some applications that do a lot of work with the string pool can run significantly faster. And from a usability point of view, the home and the end keys work in when you're using it in direct mode for read. Now, in terms of installation, there have been a number of improvements, including the ability to install plugins like Octo as part of installing YottaDB. And there are also improvements to, there's a script, there's a file that you can source called ydb env set, which sets up all of your environment. And not only does it perform better, but if you have an existing environment with existing values of YDB routines or GTM routines, YDB GBLDAR or GTM GBLDAR, it's compatible with those. And then R1.34 included enhancements and fixes from GTM through 6.3.11. Next slide, please. So one of the new languages that we added this year is the Lua Wrapper, and the Lua Wrapper is Lua is an interesting language. Came out of Brazil, and interestingly, except for the close binding to the database, I think that if mumps had been invented in the 1990s, Lua would probably be kind of what it looked like because it has many of the same characteristics. So this is work that was actually funded by the University of Antwerp library system. Next slide, please. So the Python wrapper is actually now production grade. So this is something that was started by a member of our user community, and then he was not able to finish it, so we picked it up and finished it. So again, there's a you can it's a very simple way to just directly set a global. Next slide, please. And we have the programming guide for all of the different languages. So M is a separate programmer's guide, but all the other. So if you say click on the programming in M, it'll basically take you to the M programmer's guide. But we have a multi-language programmer's guide for all the other languages. Next slide, please. Now, one of the interesting things we did this year was fuzz testing. So this is something that a researcher called Zachary Menaker of Security Innovations was interested in fuzz testing YottaDB and GTM and VistA. And he did a lot of fuzzing, found some bugs that we then fixed in our 1.34. And he also taught us how to do fuzz testing. So we actually now have one computer that is continuously fuzzing. There's a blog post about it that you can look at, and it has certainly found some bugs that we wouldn't have anticipated because when you're fuzzing code, it throws all kinds of crazy things that you wouldn't necessarily find otherwise. So it's an interesting enhancement to our testing and certainly a worthwhile one. Next slide, please. So we continue to maintain compatibility with Upstream. So this is our basic workflow, which is that as we do our, I wouldn't say workflow, let's say the releases. Um, so as we go from our 1.30 to 1.32 to 1.34 and so on, each one has a bunch of enhancements and fixes that we do. And at the same time, there is a GTM track where they put out their releases. Now, when GTM puts out a release, so again, it's not quite open source in the sense that they put out the source code, but they don't actually do their development in the open. And when they put out a release, they put out the source code for that release. And we take that source code and we have a branch on GitLab that tracks that source code. And then, since they do not release the test system, what we do is we independently write our own tests based on the release notes and on the code changes. And then we merge those. And then as we write those tests, we merge the code into our development releases. So that way, YottaDB gets all of our own enhancements and fixes, but also the GTM enhancements and fixes. But since we're doing our own independent testing, that takes us some time. So we follow a safe distance behind. So at this point, we have released 6.3011 as part of our 1.34. Internally in our development, 6.312 and 13 are merged. And then we'll continue, and they will be in our 1.36. So this is essentially the process. We take GTM releases and then merge them, test them, merge them, and then include them in YottaDB code. Next slide, please. And all of anything that we find as an issue with the upstream code base, again, is documented because all of our issues that we find are also documented and out in the open for everyone to see. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this has been on our website since the years and years ago, which is that if you're using GTM for any application, the YottaDB will be a drop-in replacement for it. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to Octo. And here I want to make a plug for Sam's Octo presentation, and that's at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday tomorrow. So I'm just going to talk about the highlights and invite you to attend his presentation if you want to know more. Next slide, please. So the important thing to remember is Octo is a SQL database, and the tables are mapped to global variables. And Octo is a YottaDB application. It's not a GTM application. So because it relies on functionality that we have that they have not adopted in the upstream code base, and it runs on but it can run if you have a production instance that's running GTM or YottaDB. You can just do an SI replication instance and then run Octo on that. And we actually have a customer running Octo in production. Their upstream uh, software is running on GTM because they're still on Red Hat 6 and haven't yet upgraded, and there's no YottaDB for Red Hat 6, but then they're replicating to YottaDB on Red Hat 8 and running Octo on that. Next slide, please. So again, a quick summary of the way Octo works, which is that it takes the schema from the application. In this case, we actually have uh, a schema generator for VistA that takes the FileMan files and FileMan file definitions and generates the create table statements for Octo. The schema comes in, it's compiled. SQL queries come in, they're compiled against the schema. We generate routines, and the routines then directly access the global variables. And as part of compiling a routine, Octo will also generate triggers, and the triggers will, so as there are updates coming in from the production system, the Octo also stays up to date with regard to cross references. And typically, you would run a reporting instance on a separate system from the production instance, so that when you're doing a search, for example, or a query, you're not affecting response time of the production system. But on the other hand, now this doesn't really apply to VistA, but if you have a production system that's using SQL in production, then of course that can run on the production system as well. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is a SQL query of Veho VistA. We have Squirrel SQL as the supported client. We're currently working on Microsoft Power BI, and I've been told that R, which is a very interesting statistical package and a very comprehensive statistical package, also works directly with Octo using its JDBC Postgres driver. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the status of Octo and the roadmap. So the initial release was SQL 92 and read-only, and we had the FileMan to Octo DDL mapping tool with some limited ODBC and JDBC client support. So where we are right now is currently focused on getting full read-write support. So today, insert, update, and delete are usable, and and then when we complete the implementation of constraints, then we'll call that essentially the next release, and it'll have full read-write support. And then, of course, the interesting thing about being in the software business is that you're never done. There's always more to do. So we're working on views. At some point, we'll start doing schemas, and then, as I said, we're working on Power BI. Or I'm told works. We haven't tested it ourselves, but it seems to work. I've done some bench testing on my laptop. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've been working on a GUI, and again, Sam is going to be talking about that this afternoon. So I invite anyone who's interested to go to that. I'm just doing a quick overview. Next slide, please. Okay, so Basically, it's for administration operations, although it certainly can, eventually maybe it'll do more, but right now our focus is on admin and ops and things like database configuration, backup, some viewing of routines. And this is still under active development, but there's a very stable field test release. And since all of our software is essentially under a continuous integration, continuous release process, you can actually just go to GitLab, do a git clone, install the software, and it becomes usable. So the GUI is basically installed as as a plugin for YottaDB. Next slide. And these are just some screenshots of the GUI. So under the covers, if you're familiar with YottaDB or with GTM, there are both the global directory and database file headers. And one of the things we try to do with the GUI is sort of hide that, because that's kind of like a low-level detail, and we're trying to present it from a user perspective. So next slide, please. So that last slide was just the dashboard, and then here are some slides. This is a view of the default region. Next slide. This is again from the dashboard how you get into other parts of functionality. Next slide. Okay, so that was the GUI, and again, please ask any questions and certainly attend Sam's presentation. I'll now talk about DevOps and CI/CD. So again, Sam has a presentation. So basically, I'm just, I guess, doing the introductions to Sam's presentations. So Sam has a presentation at 3 o'clock tomorrow Eastern time. So please attend that.
Very funny, very funny.
Sorry,
Just saying,
sorry, Sam.
very funny. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Hey, listen. You know, I, years ago I saw this cartoon where this, you know, conductor of an orchestra walks up to the podium, and the instructions on the podium are wave the baton, when the music stops, turn around and take a bow. So I actually just take the bow, and everyone else does all the hard work. Next slide, please. Okay, so containers, we've had the ability to run on containers for a long time. So we just do Docker run, and there's your container, and we actually publish Docker files of a number of containers. And again, Kubernetes knows how to run Docker containers, so you can actually run it under Kubernetes as well. And yes, we also do CI/CD. I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. That wasn't quite the slide I had in mind. Sam, I think you changed the. There we go. Yep, thank you. So next slide, please. Okay, so one of the other things we've done is go to a continuous integration, continuous delivery model of all of our software except YottaDB, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So for all of our software, we have a CI pipeline. And for a pull request to be merged, the CI pipeline, we expect it to require it to pass before it is merged. And that CI pipeline for the software is essentially a complete set of functional tests for that software. So if you want the latest software from YottaDB, you just do a git clone, and then you can install it, and you have the latest software. Okay, so you don't have to wait for the release. The exception is YottaDB itself, the core database. We have a very basic CI pipeline there, but the tests of YottaDB actually are pretty comprehensive, because they involve on probably a couple dozen computers of different architectures, building up to huge databases, crashing those databases, recovering those databases, and so on. So they actually take a few days for the full test suite to run. So YottaDB itself doesn't quite have that same model. That said, even on YottaDB, any pull request that goes up to GitHub before it gets merged, we will have done testing, and there is a very basic CI pipeline. So for development environments and for test environments, certainly for YottaDB also, you should feel free to just do a git clone and a build and an install. Whereas for production environments, we suggest using the formal releases. Next slide, please. Okay, and then because we have a fairly extensive ecosystem, um, I have some examples other than we also have an ecosystem of language wrappers. So, for example, David Wixel, who's on the call, has developed NodeM, which is the Node.js wrapper for YottaDB, and others have developed other wrappers. But these are ecosystem examples of other than language wrappers. Next slide, please. So this is Ram Shailopal. He's attending actually, and he lives in Birmingham, England, and is basically passionate about open source and about DevOps and automation and lots of things. So you can read about him on GitLab. So he's done a lot of work. Next slide, please. So one of the things he's done, Grafana is a widely used tool for open source tool for system monitoring, and YottaDB has got a utility program for monitoring the database. So yeah, he's hooked it up to Grafana, so you can actually monitor database operation in real time. Next slide, please. He's also enabled editing in Visual Studio. Next slide, please. He's done a comparison of YottaDB versus RocksDB, and I think RocksDB it's either the LinkedIn or the Facebook database that they use, and so there's a comparison of the two, and all of his work, by the way, you can find on GitHub under his page, and so everything that I referred to and a lot more is out there. But this is a comparison of YottaDB with RocksDB. Next slide, please. He's also done a quick comparison of different web frameworks for accessing uh, YottaDB code. And the interesting result is that you know both the Lua and the Rust frameworks actually run faster than the native M framework. But anyway, so the comparison is out there. He's also blogged about it. He's also a guest blog poster. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on. Um, Steph Lally is a mumps developer who lives in Amsterdam. He's also working for us as a contractor and has developed, he's the one who's doing the work on the GUI, but he's also doing his, developing his own software. And he is developing something called JSON Hives, which is a JSON document store. And you can think of it kind of like MongoDB or Couchbase. It's still in development, but it's functional enough that you can do some interesting things with it. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a he's provided some comparison with MongoDB, and the caveats for the next slides is that JSON hives are still in development, and both were compared out of the box. So he didn't try and tune MongoDB or do anything. They just as you install it and run it, how it performs. Next slide, please. So these are a description of the sort of to make it an apples to apples comparison. This is what is loaded and the containers that he ran on. Next slide, please. And then these are the clients that he used. So for JSON Hives, he has a Node.js driver, and for MongoDB, he used Bongo, which is, I guess, one of the faster clients. and he did page fetches with 50 records each. Next slide. So this is the bulk insert of records. And as you can see, in this case, MongoDB is somewhat faster than YottaDB, or JSON Hives, I should say, because YottaDB is just the database under the covers. Next slide, please. So on the querying, so this is the one select, and in this case, your JSON Hives is quite a bit faster. Next slide. And again, another query. Next slide. Yet another query. And it looks like, I'm sorry, go back to the last one. So the interesting thing here is that it looks like MongoDB has essentially a flat access time regardless of whether it's the first page or the next page, whereas JSON Hives speeds up next page access. Next slide. And another query comparison. Next slide. One important difference is that MongoDB is really not free and open source software. So there's a blog at opensource.org about it. They have something called a server-side public license, which is kind of like an open source, but not quite open source if you choose to run it on in the cloud or on a server. And YottaDB and JSON Hives. YottaDB is 100% open source, and JSON Hives, when it's released, it will be 100% open source. And he doesn't have an exact time for releasing JSON Hives, just because he's that's a project he's doing on his own time, as and when he can spare the time from making money to put food on the table. Next slide. Okay, so also in our open source ecosystem is Rob Tweed, and he has done a lot of work on uh, basically browser and Node.js access to YottaDB, but primarily in the browser and creating rich web applications. Next slide. So one of his uh, some interesting work that he did is a comparison of several key value data stores, and you can see that there's the URL where he's done the work. And by the way, this is not when it says 1.23 seconds for a YottaDB set, it's not one set. Obviously, it's a large number of sets, but you go to his web page and it'll tell you exactly how many sets he's doing and exactly what he's doing. So you can see YottaDB versus Iris versus Redis, and BerkeleyDB is a key value database that was developed by one company, is now owned by Oracle. LMDB, I think the LMDB stands for Lightning Memory Database, but I'm not really sure. That's another open source database. So these are comparisons that Rob has done. Next slide, please. Okay, so the roadmap, the road ahead. So where we've been successful. So at this point, what I believe is the largest VistA system anywhere in the world, which is the Hakim system in Jordan, is running on YottaDB. And this is the Ministry of Health system, and it essentially covers the almost all of the country, the Ministry of Health hospitals and clinics. And tomorrow, Omar is going to tell us more about Hakim, and then on Sunday, Yazid is going to talk a little bit about automation that he's done at Hakim. Both of those should be very interesting talks. So I'd invite you to attend. There are large banking systems running on YottaDB, and as I said, we've got paying customers for using YottaDB from multiple languages and from SQL. So, well, there are things that have not been so successful. So YottaDB actually is an excellent fit for IoT applications, because of the fact that we have such good performance on a 32-bit Raspberry Pi Zero, for you'd think that there'd be applications where it would fit, but I think that there's a technical fit, but we don't yet have that first adopter. And typically in an IoT stack, you have things running on the edge, you have things running in the cloud, and of course we run everywhere in between. And one of the other things about YottaDB is also because we run on the ARM architecture in both 32 and 64-bit architectures. We can run in places where low power applications are needed. But we're still looking for that first adopter. Next slide, please. Okay, and some of our ongoing challenges. Recruiting continues to be a problem. Finding the right talent, because it takes a certain set of skills and discipline to develop inside the AutoDB code. And marketing will be positive for the pandemic. We actually had started in 2019 actively going out to attend shows. We're slowly resuming that. So we're going to be at All Things Open in Raleigh, North Carolina on November 1st and 2nd. And if anyone is going to be in the area, please, stop by. And one of the things that I think we may have to do is find some marketing partners, because clearly we have a good handle on the technical side. But I think that perhaps we may need to do better in terms of finding partners who can take the software out to different markets and industries. But again, this is kind of where I'm spending some of my time in, looking ahead. And I think that should bring us to the end. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So that is the end. So, please ask any questions or, comments. Unfortunately, I'm not there in person, so you can't throw rotten tomatoes at me.